I had long believed change was for the young. At 55, my days moved like gentle water in a shallow stream, predictable, modest, and quiet. I lived a life built on rhythms I no longer questioned. Mornings began with coffee on the back porch, steam curling upward into the soft haze of dawn. Then came work, nothing glamorous, just managing paperwork at a dental office, and evenings wrapped themselves around family dinners, laundry folded with methodical care, and television murmuring in the background as my husband dozed in his recliner. If you'd asked me then, I'd have said I was content. Not joyful, not curious. Just content. But then I met him. It was a Tuesday in late October when the leaves had turned and the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen things. I took my usual walk through the park near the river after work, as I often did when I needed to stretch the tightness from my shoulders and the stillness from my legs. That afternoon, the sky was a silver quilt, and a cool breeze brushed against my cheeks like the memory of a kiss. And there he was, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, just where the path curved. He wore an old camel-colored coat and a dark scarf wound tight around his neck. A book rested on his knee, half forgotten, and his eyes, sharp blue and unusually alert, were fixed on the river as though it held secrets he alone could hear. He didn't look at me at first. I remember slowing slightly, puzzled by the strange magnetism of him. Not handsome in a traditional sense, his face was weathered, with lines around his mouth and eyes that suggested a man who had once smiled often and maybe hadn't in some time, but there was something alive in him. Something awake. I was just about to pass by when he said without turning, "Funny, how we let whole seasons slip by without noticing we're aging alongside them." I stopped. The words struck something in me, as though they had been waiting in the air for years and only just then found a mouth to speak them. "I'm sorry," I asked, my voice cautious, unsure if he was addressing me or merely speaking aloud to the wind. Now he turned. His gaze met mine, and I felt the strangest sensation, like someone had reached into the center of me and found something delicate and unopened. "You walk here often," he said, not unkindly. "You always look like you're trying to remember something." A flutter of embarrassment stirred in my chest. "I don't. How would you know that?" "I've seen you. Tuesdays. Thursdays. Always alone. Always lost in thought." I gave a small, nervous laugh, unsure whether to be flattered or unsettled. "And what does that mean exactly?" "It means," he said, "that I think you're on the edge of something, but you haven't realized it yet." I didn't know what to say. It felt too intimate, too presumptive, and yet I couldn't bring myself to walk away. The breeze tugged at my hair, and a crow cawed sharply in the distance, but all I could hear was the echo of his words, on the edge of something. We stood there like that, him seated, me standing, until I felt a quiet invitation in the moment, a space being offered. "I'm Anna," I said finally. He smiled, slow and warm. "Thomas." He gestured toward the empty space beside him. And against all logic, all habit, I sat. That's how it began. Not with fireworks or danger or even attraction, but with a man in a coat speaking words that felt like they were meant only for me. And I would later wonder, was it the moment itself that changed me, or the realization days later that I had let it? There's a peculiar silence that falls between two strangers when something unspoken passes between them, something not yet named, but deeply felt. That was the quiet between Thomas and me as we sat on the bench, side by side, watching the river slip past in the fading light. I wasn't used to silence with other people. At home, it was filled with the clatter of dinner plates, the drone of the news, the occasional weary laugh from my husband, James. At work, it was the silence of resignation, of tired teeth and tighter budgets. But this silence felt different. Sacred, almost. As though anything said too quickly might break it. He didn't ask me questions, not then. Just sat quietly, one leg crossed over the other, book still unopened on his knee. After a while, he spoke again. "Do you know the river doesn't flow the same way twice?" I turned to him. "You mean because the water keeps changing?" He nodded. "Yes. But also because we do. Each time we look at it, we're someone slightly different." There was something in the way he said it, not preachy, not philosophical for the sake of sounding wise. It was as if he was trying to explain something to himself through me. I smiled, the corners of my mouth tugging upward like they hadn't in weeks. "You talk like someone who's spent a lot of time thinking." He glanced at me with a sideways grin. Too much, maybe? But thinking's all right, as long as you don't confuse it for living. I let his words settle. A few feet away, a woman in a red coat jogged by with a dog, and the scent of damp earth drifted up from the riverbank. I looked at the sky. It had taken on that deep indigo hue that always made me feel like time had slowed. "What were you reading?" I asked, nodding at the book on his lap. He held it up. "Rilke. Letters to a Young Poet." The spine was cracked and worn. "It's a conversation across time," he said. "One man trying to teach another how to live honestly. Does it help?" Thomas's mouth twitched, half amused. "Some days." I folded my hands in my lap. I didn't know why I stayed so long on that bench with him. Maybe it was the stillness or the way his words pulled thoughts out of me I hadn't touched in years. Maybe it was the simple fact that I didn't feel like I had to explain myself. We watched the river until the light began to fall into itself and the air took on a sharper chill. I stood first. "I should go. My husband will be wondering." Thomas looked up at me, nodding, not surprised. "Will you be back Thursday?" I hesitated. There was no reason to return. But my heart answered before my mind did. "Yes." He gave a small, satisfied smile. "Then I'll see you." I walked home slower than usual. The leaves crunched beneath my shoes, and I could feel a strange warmth rising in my chest, a bloom of something like aliveness. Not romance, not yet. But a kind of remembrance. Of who I had once been before life became all duty and routine. That night, I stood a little longer in the bathroom mirror. Not judging, just looking. My face, the one I knew so well, looked different somehow, as if it had been stirred gently from sleep. James was already in bed when I climbed in beside him. He murmured a good night, half asleep, and I kissed his shoulder out of habit. He didn't stir. I lay awake, my hands tucked beneath my pillow, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling I knew by heart. And I wondered, when was the last time someone saw me before they knew what I was? Thursday came cloaked in the kind of overcast melancholy that makes the world feel quieter, like it's holding its breath. The office was slow that day, one cancellation after another, and by 2 o'clock, I found myself tidying files I'd already sorted and staring too long out the window. I told my coworker, Natalie, that I had errands to run, and she nodded absently, more invested in her phone than my plans. No one ever asked where I went after work. I was invisible in a way that felt oddly convenient. No expectations, no questions. Just me, slipping out the back door, keys in hand, heart racing for reasons I pretended not to understand. By the time I reached the park, the trees had begun their slow undressing, yellow leaves fluttering to the path like confetti at a wedding no one had attended. The bench was empty. I tried not to feel the drop in my chest as I approached it. Maybe he'd forgotten. Maybe he hadn't meant it when he said, "I'll see you." Maybe he had simply been kind to a woman who lingered too long beside him. I sat anyway, folding my hands in my lap, willing myself not to look around too anxiously. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. And then I heard it. The familiar shuffle of his shoes against gravel. "You're early," he said behind me, his voice like warm cloth. "Or I'm late." I turned, unable to stop the smile that rose before I could control it. "You had me thinking you changed your mind." He gave a half shrug. "I almost did. But then I remembered how nice it was. Just talking." Thomas settled beside me, the same worn coat, the same book now tucked beneath his arm. His presence was quiet but grounding, like an old oak at your back. I didn't realize how much of my life had become filled with people who needed something from me, answers, help, dinner, patience. He didn't. He just sat. We didn't talk right away. And again, it felt okay. The world moved around us, a child in a bright yellow raincoat kicking leaves into the air, an old couple holding hands as they passed, their steps slow but certain. I watched them, and something in me ached, not with longing, but with recognition. I used to hold James's hand like that. Before the years made us more partners in logistics than lovers. "I brought something," Thomas said, reaching into his coat. He pulled out a folded slip of paper, yellowed and delicate. He handed it to me without explanation. I unfolded it carefully. A poem. Not printed, but typed on a typewriter, faint, uneven ink. It read, The trouble with stillness is that it never begs for attention. It waits. It whispers. It only answers if you ask the right kind of silence. And yet, that is where the truth begins. Not in the noise, but the pause between the noise. I read it twice, then a third time. The words were simple, but they found a place inside me I hadn't dusted in years. "Did you write this?" I asked. He nodded, looking out toward the river. "It's beautiful," I said, voice hushed like I was afraid of breaking it. "I wrote it after my wife died. I used to think silence was something you endured. Turns out it's where all the answers are." I glanced at him then. The way his shoulders hunched slightly forward. The careful way he folded his hands. He had loved deeply once. I could see it in the way he said "my wife," as if her memory still lived in the air beside him. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. Thomas gave a small smile. "Don't be. It taught me how to listen." A breeze swept past, lifting the poem slightly from my lap before I caught it with my fingers. And I realized then, I had spent so much of my life filling silence, with conversation, with obligations, with noise. I hadn't listened in years, not even to myself. We sat until the light thinned and our shadows stretched long across the path. As we stood to leave, I hesitated. "Thomas, do you come here often to meet people like this? Or just me?" He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then softly, "Just you." I thought of him constantly after that Thursday. Not in a romantic way, at least that's what I told myself. It wasn't infatuation, wasn't longing. It was more like a stirring, a slow, persistent shift in the air around my life. I began to notice how many of my days passed in a fog of habit. I would find myself halfway through folding laundry, holding James's blue dress shirt in my hands and suddenly wondering, what did I used to dream about? I remembered vaguely a version of myself who once painted, who played piano badly but joyfully, who had once applied to an MFA program in her 20s, got in and didn't go, because James had proposed that same spring, and love had felt like a direction. That version of me had been quietly sealed off, like a room with the door shut for decades. And now Thomas had turned the knob. That Saturday, I told James the first needed a long walk. He didn't ask questions, just nodded from his recliner where the television flickered across his face. He was a good man, predictable, loyal, but I couldn't remember the last time he'd really looked at me. The park was quiet that afternoon, the sky bruised with the promise of rain. I didn't expect to see Thomas. I hadn't told him I'd be there. But I walked the path anyway, hands deep in my coat pockets, my breath curling in front of me like smoke. I found myself near our bench. It was empty, but I sat anyway. I closed my eyes and tried to recall the exact timbre of his voice, that low, steady calm like a cello played in another room. I tried to conjure the scent of him, wool and something faintly herbal like cedar or sage. I thought of his poem again. The way it said the truth begins not in the noise, but the pause between the noise. And that was when I realized what I had been missing for so long. Stillness. Not the kind forced upon you by routine or fatigue, but the kind you choose. The kind that lets you sit with yourself long enough to feel what has been waiting in the dark. I opened my eyes. Leaves skittered across the pavement. A family passed behind me, their laughter trailing like ribbons in the wind. And suddenly I felt it. Not loneliness but solitude. The good kind. The kind that made me remember I belonged to myself. When I returned home, James was asleep in his chair, the soft buzz of the television washing over him. I stood in the doorway a moment, studying the man I'd shared so many years with. The man I'd cooked for, cried with, grown up beside. And yet, as I watched him, I felt something unsteady inside me. Not absence, not anger, but distance. Like we had once stood at the center of the same house, and over time, had wandered into different wings. I went upstairs, pulled out an old shoebox from the back of the closet, and lifted the lid. Inside were scraps of poems I'd written in college, a Polaroid of me covered in charcoal from a figure drawing class, and a postcard I'd never sent from Paris, dated 1989. I stared at it for a long time. Then I got out a notebook, and I began to write. Not for anyone else, just to hear my own voice again. The next time I saw Thomas, it was nearly 2 weeks later. I hadn't planned it that way. Life simply got in the way, as it often does. An unexpected appointment at work, James catching a stomach bug that turned our small house into a place of soup, soft blankets, and half-slept nights. But in those days of care and quiet tending, something shifted. Not in my love for James, that had its own weathered strength, but in how I measured myself inside this life I'd built. I no longer felt like a figure within the house. I felt like someone looking at it from slightly outside the frame. So when I returned to the park on a windbrush Thursday, my breath caught the moment I saw him. Thomas, seated in his usual spot, one leg crossed over the other, eyes scanning the water with a stillness that made time feel thinner. He saw me approach, and his face softened, not into a grin, not even a smile, but something quieter. Something closer to relief. "I was beginning to think you'd disappeared," he said. "I nearly did," I replied. But only from myself. Thomas tilted his head, and the wind picked up around us, scattering brittle leaves like secrets. I sat beside him, and we didn't speak for several minutes. He was the first to break the silence. "I used to think solitude was the loneliest thing a person could carry," he murmured. "Until I realized it's not the being alone that hurts. It's being with people who make you feel unseen." I nodded slowly. "That's the part that's been unraveling in me." He looked at me carefully then, his gaze almost reverent. "What have you found?" I hesitated. I started writing again. His face lit with a quiet joy, but he didn't interrupt. "I used to before marriage, before kids, before the quiet routine swallowed me whole," I said, my voice barely above the wind. And then I stopped. I thought no one needed my words. "But you did," he said, and I felt the truth of it land gently against my chest. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a page from my notebook. I hadn't intended to share it. I don't even know what made me bring it. "I wrote this last week," I said. "Would you want to hear it?" Thomas nodded, his expression solemn. I unfolded the paper, smoothing its creases with trembling fingers. And I read. "I have lived inside a house with soft walls and silent mornings. I have cooked meals in folded shirts and given away entire years in the name of love. But I forgot my own name once. Forgot how it sounded whispered in my own voice. And now slowly I am learning to say it again." When I finished, he didn't speak right away. Then softly, "That's not just a poem. That's a reckoning." I looked down, not trusting my own voice. Thomas leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you walking through here?" I shook my head. "I thought, there's a woman who knows how to move without rushing. Like she's trying not to disturb something inside her." I swallowed hard, something tightening in my throat. "That's how I recognized you," he said. "Because I walked the same way." The river whispered beside us, a constant hush against the world's noise. Clouds rolled in slow and heavy, their bellies gray with coming rain. "I should go," I said eventually, rising to my feet. "James will be waiting." Thomas nodded, standing too. "Will you come back next week?" "I think so," I said. "I think I need to." As I walked away, I felt it. Not a goodbye, not a beginning. Something else. Something like unfolding. A slow return to the woman I'd once tucked away in the corners of her own life. James asked me that evening if I'd stopped by the bakery on my way home. It was an innocent question, one he'd asked countless times, because he liked their rye with the cracked crust and fennel seeds. I told him no, I hadn't thought to. He didn't press further, just nodded and turned back to the stove where pasta simmered in salted water. That was James, steady, simple in his rituals, kind in the ways men are taught to be kind. He had loved me through the births of our daughters, through the death of his mother, through years when neither of us knew how to speak the right kind of softness. And yet, that night, as we sat across from one another, the overhead light making a gold island of the kitchen table, I couldn't help thinking of Thomas. Of how he listened. How he saw silence not as something to fill but as something to enter. The way a priest steps into a cathedral. Reverent. Quiet. Did you go walking today? James asked, his fork scraping the last of the sauce from his plate. I nodded. I did. That's good. You always seem more relaxed after. I hesitated, wondering if he'd hear what I wasn't saying. But he didn't. He stood, kissed my temple absently, and retreated to the den, where the low hum of a game show greeted him like an old friend. I stayed at the table, tracing the rim of my glass with one fingertip, watching how the wine shifted with each small movement. I could feel something living in the stillness between us. Something old. Something I had carried for too long without words. The next Thursday I wore lipstick. Not red, something quieter. A shade that matched the faint flush of my cheeks in winter. I hadn't worn it in years. Not because I'd stopped caring, but because I'd stopped noticing what made me feel beautiful. Somewhere between the PTA meetings and bedtime routines, I'd packed away those small vanities, like keepsakes from a girl who no longer had use for them. But that day I noticed. I noticed the way the color softened the tiredness in my eyes. The way I walked just a little taller. And when I reached the bench and saw Thomas already there, I knew I didn't want to be invisible anymore. He looked up as I approached. Something flickered in his gaze, something that registered and then respectfully passed. Like he knew not to name it. You changed something, he said softly. I smiled, sitting beside him. Just remembering who I used to be. Thomas didn't press. He never did. He simply let the conversation build like a tide, slow and inevitable. Have you told him? He asked after a long pause. I didn't need to ask who he meant. No, I said quietly. Not yet. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I told mine. That startled me. I turned toward him. My wife, he said, clarifying. Before she died. I told her about a woman I had feelings for. It wasn't an affair. But it could have been if we weren't careful. I needed to be honest with her. And she forgave me. Before I'd even asked. I felt the wind thread through my scarf, tugging gently, the air filled with the scent of turning earth. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because you carry the same weight I did. The guilt that doesn't come from betrayal, but from rediscovery. And because you're allowed to want something and still be a good person. His words sat heavy in me, like a warm stone in my chest. I don't know what I want, I whispered. He looked at me then, really looked. Yes, you do, he said. You're just afraid to say it aloud. I couldn't respond. Not because he was wrong, but because he wasn't. So instead, I sat beside him while the wind moved through the trees and the river shimmered like a silver mirror, reflecting all the selves I'd left behind. And I thought about names. The ones we speak. And the ones we never do. It was raining the day I didn't go home right away. Not a dramatic, cinematic storm, just a gentle, endless drizzle that made everything smell of wet bark and leaf rot. The kind of rain that slows the world to a hush and gives you permission to linger. I sat in my car outside the cafe near the park, windshield wipers moving in lazy rhythm, heart thudding with a quiet insistence. I didn't plan to meet him. I didn't even know if he'd be there. But some part of me, a part one hadn't trusted in a long time, was guiding me by something more ancient than logic. And so I stepped out into the rain, coat pulled close, and crossed the street to the small brick cafe with the old brass bell on the door that chimed as I pushed it open. And there he was. Seated near the back, a mug cupped between his hands, gaze distant, as if he were remembering something that didn't belong to this world. I stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching him. The slope of his shoulders. The way he blinked slowly like he was listening to something only he could hear. He looked up. And smiled, soft and surprised, like sunlight slipping between clouds. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said as I approached. I wasn't either, I replied, sliding into the seat across from him. We didn't speak for a while. Just let the clatter of cups and low hum of conversation fill the space between us. It was warm there, in that little cafe, a warmth not just of temperature, but of being in a place where time felt slower, more forgiving. As if it didn't matter where else we were supposed to be. I lied, I said eventually. He looked at me carefully. Last time. When I said I didn't know what I wanted. Thomas nodded, waiting. I do know, I said. I want to feel awake again. I want to stop walking through my life like it's already over. He sat back, breathing in slowly. And does that have anything to do with me? Yes, I said simply. But not the way you might think. His brow furrowed slightly. You didn't create this feeling, I continued. You just made me see it. And that's somehow even more terrifying. His expression softened, and for a moment, I saw it, all of him. The loneliness he carried like an old coat. The grief that never left but simply rearranged itself to fit around his days. The tenderness. The restraint. I think, he said carefully, we meet certain people not because they're meant to stay, but because they're meant to unearth us. I swallowed the ache those words caused. Because even now, even in this stolen hour in a cafe that seemed suspended from consequence, I didn't know what kind of story this was becoming. A love story? A friendship? A prelude to a leaving? Or something else entirely? I want to keep meeting you, I said finally, voice low. Even if it's just here. In this place. Where time doesn't push so hard. Thomas nodded. Then we'll make a room with no clocks. Just you and me and whatever honesty we can bear. I looked down at my hands, suddenly small and unfamiliar. Do you ever feel like you're becoming someone new and shedding someone else all at once? He smiled. Every day. Outside, the rain had grown heavier. People passed in coats and umbrellas, heads down, moving through their own narratives. And inside, at that small table with 2 cups and too many unsaid things between us, I felt a strange peace settle into my bones. Not a resolution. Not an answer. But the first breath after the question. James noticed the lipstick. It was subtle, but he noticed. One evening, a Tuesday, I was making tea and he leaned in from the hallway, squinting as if searching for something he couldn't name. Are you going somewhere? He asked. No, I replied without turning. Why? He shrugged, hesitant. Just, you look different lately. I stirred the honey into my cup, watching it disappear like a secret sinking into warmth. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure how to. Later in bed, I lay awake listening to his breath, the slow rise and fall of a man who trusted his life to hold its shape. And I wondered what part of me had stayed asleep beside him for so long. What softness I had once offered freely, only to tuck it quietly away when there was no space for it to bloom. The next day, I wrote a letter I didn't send. Dear James, I don't know how to say this aloud, so I'm writing it instead. Something in me is changing. Not because of another man. Not exactly. But because I remembered I used to be more than someone's wife, someone's mother, someone who remembers the dry cleaning and the neighbor's birthday. I remembered I used to want things. And I'm trying to find that woman again. I folded the paper neatly and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. For now it was enough just to say it, even in ink. Thomas and I began to meet on Sundays. Not every week. Just enough that it became something I looked forward to, not as an escape, but as a return. A pause. A breath. We didn't speak of love. Not in the traditional sense. But the way he looked at me, it was as if he could hear thoughts I didn't say. Like he had known my silences before I ever stepped into his life. That Sunday we didn't sit at the bench. We walked. Down the narrow path along the river, past the grove where the birches bent like old men, their white bark peeling in curls like forgotten letters. I kept my hands in my pockets. He kept his close to his sides, fingers brushing the hem of his coat. We passed a woman sitting on the grass, painting with watercolors. Her canvas was small, but her focus was total. I slowed as we passed, watching the way her brush moved like it was answering some quiet question inside her. I used to do that, I murmured. Thomas looked at me. Why did you stop? I didn't know how to answer. There were too many reasons. Not enough time. Not enough space. Too many dinners to cook, bills to pay, expectations to meet. Too many years where the color had quietly drained from my life and I hadn't even noticed until it was gone. He didn't press. But a few steps later he said, sometimes the door stays shut so long, we forget it was ever meant to open. That stayed with me. We walked in silence for a while until the trail narrowed and dipped into a hollow where the sound of the river deepened. It was colder there. Damp. Like walking into a cathedral made of moss and stone. He stopped. I need to ask you something, he said. I nodded, bracing for the thing I didn't want to name. But he surprised me. Do you think you can want more without losing what you already have? The question hit like a soft hammer to the heart. Because it wasn't about us. It was about me. About all the selves I'd abandoned. About the house I'd built with James and whether I had the courage to walk through it not as a ghost, but as a woman with color on her lips and poems in her hands. I don't know, I said. Thomas nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. But then, almost as an afterthought, he whispered, maybe the wanting is the beginning. Not of loss, but of life. We walked back in silence, the air heavy with the weight of that door. And all the rooms it might open if only I let it. The letter didn't stay in the drawer. I hadn't planned to give it to James. It wasn't written for that. It was a confession to myself, a mirror I hadn't dared to hold. But one evening, after a dinner too quiet to bear, I found myself slipping it onto the side of the bed while he was in the shower. I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. Then I went downstairs, made tea with shaking hands, and waited. I heard his footsteps long before I saw him, measured, slow, the kind of steps taken by someone trying to decide what to say before they arrive. When he entered the kitchen, he didn't speak at first. Just leaned against the doorframe, holding the folded letter between two fingers like it was something fragile. Or dangerous. His eyes looked older than they had that morning. Is this about him? He asked, his voice surprisingly soft. I didn't lie. No. It's about me. He nodded. The silence between us was heavy but not cruel. Like standing in an empty hallway and hearing your own breath echo. I thought we were, all right, he said. So did I answered. He walked to the window, staring into the night beyond it. The garden was shadowed and quiet, the hydrangeas long wilted, their heads bowed like mourners. We had built that garden together. Planted every flower, pulled every weed. But I couldn't remember the last time we had stood in it together. I didn't know you were lonely, he said. And for a moment, I hated how gently he said it. Like loneliness was something polite. Something that sat beside you at dinner and never interrupted. I didn't know either, I whispered. Not until someone asked me what I wanted. And I didn't have an answer. James turned to me then, eyes full of something I couldn't name. Not anger. Not sadness. Something closer to grief. The kind you feel when you realize you've lost something by not noticing it was slipping away. I never wanted to make you disappear, he said. I know, I replied. And I meant it. We didn't fight. We didn't cry. We just stood there, two people who had loved each other for decades, now staring across a gap that had grown quietly between us like ivy over brick. That night, I didn't sleep in our bed. I took the guest room, wrapped myself in a blanket that smelled like cedar and old books, and stared at the ceiling while the wind tapped gently against the window pane. Sunday came again. I didn't bring poetry. I didn't bring questions. I just brought myself. Thomas was already at the bench when I arrived, a thermos of coffee resting beside him. He looked up, studied my face, and didn't ask what had changed. But he knew something had. You told him, he said. I nodded. I left the letter. He handed me a cup and we drank in silence. Are you afraid? He asked. I watched two ducks drift lazily across the water. Yes. But it's not the kind of fear that wants to run. It's the kind that asks you to stay. To feel all of it. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the morning. I was in love with her until the end, he said suddenly, his voice low. But I didn't see her fully until the last year. That's my regret. I looked at him, his hands wrapped around the mug, the light touching the silver in his beard. There was no weight in his words, just truth delivered plainly, the way someone might hand you a stone they've carried too long. Do you think it's too late? I asked. For what, he said. To become someone new. Thomas looked at me, really looked. No, he said. But it's almost too late to keep pretending you haven't already started. A breeze passed between us, full of fallen leaves and the scent of wet bark. I closed my eyes. And for the first time in a long time I felt proud of myself. Not for who I had been. Not even for who I was becoming. But for finally listening. Autumn began to fade. The trees, once gold, copper, and crimson, had shed their color in soft heaps along the path. The wind had grown sharper, the mornings colder. And still the river kept moving. Steady. tireless, carrying its stories to places none of us would ever see. I stood on the porch that morning with a suitcase at my feet. Not large, just enough for a few days. Enough to say I need space. Enough to say I need to hear my own voice without echo. James had watched me pack. He hadn't offered to help, but he hadn't stopped me either. "We'll be okay," he'd said as I zipped the case shut. "I just want you to come back to yourself, even if it means stepping away from me to do it." There was pain in his eyes, but also love. Real love, the kind that lets go, not out of indifference, but from respect. I kissed his cheek before I left, and he held my hand a moment longer than usual. Neither of us said goodbye. Only thank you. I didn't go far. Just a cabin a few miles from the park, tucked behind a grove of pines where the only sounds were wind, birdsong, and the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my steps. There was a fireplace, a table for writing, and a small window overlooking the river. I didn't tell Thomas where I was going, but I left a note on our bench. I need a week to listen to the stillness. If the river is still telling stories by then, I'll meet you here. I spent those days without makeup, without mirrors, without noise. I wrote until my fingers cramped. I made soup from scratch. I watched the stars alone, wrapped in a wool blanket, naming constellations I had long forgotten. Each day, I asked myself what I wanted. Not what I should do. Not what others needed. Just what I wanted. And slowly answers came. Not like lightning. More like candlelight, flickering truths I had to protect from the wind. I wanted to live in color again. To paint. To write. To be kissed like it mattered. I wanted mornings with coffee and silence, not as a compromise, but a choice. I wanted to be seen, not for what I gave, but for what I was. And I wanted to offer that seeing in return. When I returned, the park was washed in pale gray, a faint mist clinging to the air like a veil. I wore my favorite coat. Lipstick again. Not for him. For me. Thomas was there. He stood when he saw me, not smiling, just watching with a quiet steadiness. I approached slowly, hands in my pockets, heart loud in my chest. "You came back," he said. I did. And I took a deep breath. And I'm not ready to leave my marriage. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I'm also not ready to return to who I was before. He nodded slowly. There was no disappointment in his face. Only something like peace. "I wasn't waiting for a decision," he said. "I was hoping for your truth." We sat on the bench. The wind was colder now. A few stubborn leaves still clung to the trees, glowing amber in the muted light. Everything around us felt bare, but not empty. Honest. Stripped down to what remained. I looked at Thomas. "What happens now?" He gave a small, almost shy smile. "Now? We keep showing up. You. Me. The river. Maybe we write. Maybe we sit. Maybe we say nothing and let the silence speak." I reached for his hand. He let me take it. And it felt like holding a mirror. One that didn't reflect what I had lost, but what I had found. We sat until the clouds opened slightly, just enough for a single beam of sunlight to fall through the branches, warming the space between us. And I thought, maybe this is love. Not the burning kind, but the kind that holds your story in its hands, reads it gently, and says, "You can begin again."